Is fiber the secret to a long and healthy life? Does it keep you regular, or is it just a bunch of shit? Let's get into it. Today we're responding to a video from Layne Norton, who I like to call Layne Norton, in keeping with my friend Bart's notations. Does eating fiber help you live longer? Educational video. Okay, let's get into it. I'm not, I'm not really looking forward to this, but I think we do have to talk about the whole fiber issue.
If you don't want to die young, eat fiber.
So that is, there has to be something called responsibility. I know Layne is like mostly for comic relief, and I assume people don't take him seriously. But when I look at his comments, I kind of think people are taking him seriously. So you have to be careful when you're saying this stuff. We are professionals, we are coaches, we are health educators, whatever we are. And with that comes a certain amount of responsibility. Someone can be doing the best thing in the whole world. I'm not that fiber is, and they can get hit by a car tomorrow. So how you say things is super important. Like, I'm not saying that someone is going to think that, eating oatmeal is going to save them from getting hit by a car, but still you got to be very, very careful, because it's not so much about getting a car. Like, I talk to people every day who feel that they have been injured by consuming excess fiber, right? Now, whether or not that's true, I can't say. There was not a randomized controlled trial that can prove or disprove someone's experience like that. But it's entirely possible, as we'll get into in this video.
Guys, I've been talking about fiber for a long time now. In fact, I think we should probably rename this the Protein and Fiber Show, to be honest.
Muscle and poop. Sounds good. I think that's Mr. Muscle and Poop. I like that, Layne.
Because I talk about the importance of getting enough fiber in terms of cardiovascular disease, risk of mortality.
So like, just think logically here. Cardiovascular disease is caused by microlesions. Everyone agrees with this, even the cholesterol crew, right? Microlesions in the arteries due to high blood pressure and other things. High blood pressure is necessary but not sufficient to give it to one, right? And you think that eating indigestible carbohydrates, like let's get our definition straight. The definition of fiber is indigestible carbohydrates. That is the definition of it, right? And you think that eating more indigestible carbohydrate is going to have something to do with the arteries in your heart? Like, does that make any sense at all?
Cancer. There's just so much evidence.
When he's saying these things, I'm pretending that I don't understand what he's saying. I should not do that. I should just explain, look, he's basing this all, in fact, this whole video, I expect, though I haven't seen it in its entirety, this whole video is going to be about associational studies, right? So it is probably true that populations that eat more fiber in the United States, especially, are at a lower, or tend to have lower incidence of cardiovascular disease, because those people are just consuming less sugar and less junk overall, right? So that is probably true, but from association, we can never infer cause and effect. Never, ever, ever. We need more evidence.
It's out there that fiber improves so many markers of health.
So again, it improves is, again, a cause and effect statement. So when you talk about markers, I suppose you can say, yeah, I mean, I took more of that, more fiber, and my A1C went down. I suppose you can actually say that, because there is a causal mechanism whereby it happens, and you'll probably find it in a lot of cases. I mean, you could also fast, right? When you can't digest the food, when you're eating fiber, you can't digest the food, just don't eat food. Maybe that's a good way to do it.
Across a broad spectrum of different populations. And we have a couple of new studies on fiber, and one that really hammers home the point. As some of you guys know, there's something called a meta-analysis.
So a meta-analysis is a compilation of several other analyses, and the meta-analysis will only be as strong. In fact, it's actually, in some ways, it's what I've learned by digging very deep into this literature. Sometimes a meta-analysis is less indicative of actual results, of actually what's going on, than a simple study, because when you group these things together, now I have to look at how these studies have been grouped together. And what were the inclusion criteria? What were the exclusion criteria? How were these things defined? Were people looking at the exact same thing when they said they were looking at the same thing? So when you're bringing in, when you're going from an analysis to a meta-analysis, in some ways, yeah, that's more, especially when we're talking about this epidemiological data, which can never be used to determine causation. In some ways, it can actually be a better hypothesis generator than other kinds of research, right? But in other ways, I find it very, very convoluted, because, again, you have to understand that there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And the chance of bias creeping in is just huge. It's just overwhelming. Bias, and also in terms of p hacking, like if you see small associations, but if you get the number big enough, you can increase that p value to where it might be worth publishing. And I think that's what we might see in one of these studies here. So, I'm very, very cautious when it comes to some of these meta-analyses and trying to extrapolate anything meaningful from it. The other thing I'll say, just as we're starting off here, is it's interesting to look at studies that prove your hypothesis, but it's far more interesting to look at studies that seem to disprove your hypothesis. So if your hypothesis is that fiber helps you live longer, why don't you look at studies that seem to go against that trend, whether epidemiological or other? I mean, that would be a real fascinating way to actually explore this. And that would be what a real scientist does. A real scientist puts forward a hypothesis and then tries to disprove it, right?
And a meta-analysis basically tries to take studies that are similar in design and compile the
how similar is the question, right? Because if they're not identical, if it's not designed by the same person, if it's not the same researcher, if it's not the same food frequency questionnaire, how similar are they?
results to come up with an overall outcome of results. Because individual studies, there can be some differences and whatnot, but a meta-analysis based on its inclusion criteria can tell us very much about the consensus of the research literature. Now, if you
so the consensus of the research, like there's a, I don't know how to say this, man. If it is the consensus of popular opinion that vegetables are healthy, right? That is the consensus of popular opinion, right? Does that make it correct? Like, just because something is the consensus, does it have anything to do with its truth value? I don't think so, right?
want to take it a step further, there's also what's called an umbrella review. And umbrella reviews are basically meta-analyses of meta-analyses. So essentially,
So in other words, you're throwing together studies that even in the original meta-analysis, there were only tenuously connected, right? Because they're different methodologies and so on. Now you're creating even bigger sets, again, probably to boost your p-value and claim that you found something when you haven't. But you're claiming bigger data sets that, again, are more likely to have confounding in them and grouping together studies that have no relation.
an umbrella review is taking different meta-analyses and combining those to try to come up with an even broader spectrum of recommendations and consensus. Now, there was a recent umbrella review published on the effect of fiber on cardiovascular disease, cancer, mortality, and several other markers of health and disease. And
so I had to look up this study. I mean, I'm not sure what he thinks it says, but I can pretty much guarantee you it doesn't say what he thinks it says.
This umbrella review had over 17 million subjects.
So the fact that it has so many subjects is actually, that's a fault, right? It's a flaw. If you have to get that number of people in order to see significant associations, probably it's not a significant association, right?
In total. That's right. I said 17 million. They found that there was very high quality evidence to show that fiber intake decreases the risk of cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular disease.
So when we go to the actual study, let me see if I can bring up the actual study. When we go to the actual study and we define these terms, very high quality evidence. So what that means, so they don't use the word very high quality. They use the word convincing, highly suggestive, or weak. And it's all by p-values, right? 10 to the minus 6, 0.001 per thousand, et cetera, et cetera. So with these hazard ratios, it's not clear to me if they're adjusted or unadjusted, right? But some of these hazard ratios are pretty meaningless, right? 0.9, 0.8. This is not significant. So anyway, so when you have such big data sets, the chances of bias creeping in are actually higher than if you had a smaller data set, right? Yeah, so all of these things are done by p-value. And because you have so many cases, because you have so many people included in this study of studies, you just need a small effect size to have a huge p-value, as we saw with those tables.
Now they categorize this based on different levels of evidence, and they have a quantitative way to rate the levels of evidence.
So it's just p-values. So it's all association, right? So the thing to remember with p-values is we're talking about effect size of things that cannot be used to draw cause and effect inferences, right? It's just associations.
Evidence. So class 1 is considered convincing evidence. Class 2 is considered highly suggestive evidence. Class 3 is considered suggestive evidence.
I just said all this, dude.
And class 4 is considered weak evidence. So they found convincing class 1 evidence that dietary fiber intake reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease.
No, they didn't. So it associated with lower incidences of cardiovascular disease for one of several possible reasons. And none of those reasons can be used to construe cause and effect. Right? This is epidemiology 101 stuff. Okay? There's no cause and effect that can be drawn, no cause and effect inference, not a single cause and effect inference. But diverticulitis, if you have an outbreak, a flare up of diverticulitis, your doctors will tell you to stop eating fiber. So, is it likely that the medical treatment for something which benefits it, which is a no fiber diet or a low fiber diet, is different? Like, is like what? How does that make any sense? When if I have the disease, I'm supposed to not eat fiber, but in order to not get the disease, I have to eat fiber.
Intestine form pouches that food trapped in and cause massive inflammation. It's very painful, and fiber has been shown to reduce the risk of that disease and reduce the risk of diverticulitis. Now, I want to point out something. When you look in meta-analysis,
so it has not been shown to reduce the risk of diverticulitis. Again, like if you have diverticulitis, you're told not to eat fiber. So, in populations that eat less fiber and more junk, are you more likely to see diverticulitis? Yes, because they're eating more junk, right? They're eating more, sugary, ultra processed junk foods. Absolutely. But have you studied a population that is eating, a low fiber, non-processed diet? No, you haven't. You haven't studied such a population, and therefore you have no basis for drawing any conclusions about such a population, because none of these 17 million people, or however many it was, were on such a diet.
And umbrella reviews of nutrition studies, very rarely do you find convincing evidence.
Yeah, and this would also be a case where it's not really convincing evidence. It's just evidence with a low p-value because of how many subjects you have included, right?
It is low, very low, or modest quality. And that is because the way nutrition...
That's because they're not very good at p-hacking, right? Like if you include enough people, you will be able to make a small effect size look like a big effect size. Effect size is not the right word. These are associations, right? So yeah, again, this is a silly debate. Like these are not studies that can inform on cause and effect. They just cannot.
Studies are designed, it's difficult to get conclusive results. But when you have so many studies,
if all the studies suffer from the same problems, what does the fact that there are so many of them saying the same thing? What is the fact that is? Why does that matter? Let me just again remind new listeners maybe of the problems we see in the epidemiological research. The main problem we see is the healthy user bias, right? Where the people who are eating more vegetables, eating more fiber, are also the people who are less likely to drink, less likely to smoke, more likely to exercise, more likely to take vitamins, etc., etc. This is not a problem that can be corrected by the various corrections that happen. And by the way, that's another problem we see, that when you correct for things such as, for example, income status or age, etc., now you are just including further biases, right? You're not reporting what you saw. You're reporting what you saw, but it's adjusted. And by the way, this is so bad that in some studies, if you read the data, you'll find that the actual data says the opposite of what the study says. I think the biggest example of this is the Adventist 2 study, where the people who ate more meat lived longer, but they adjusted it a lot. So the people who ate less meat were shown to have lived longer after the adjusted data, something like that. I may have the details wrong. If you remember the Adventist 2 study, just drop a comment below. We'll maybe it's worth doing another video on that, reminding myself of what that looked like.
Showing the same thing over and over and over again.
But again, if you have made the same mistake in your math problem and you're getting the wrong result again and again and again and again, does the fact that you don't understand it and are making the same mistake and coming to the same wrong answer 100 times, does that make it a right answer? It doesn't.
And even if some of the individual studies are relatively weak in design, when you have such repeated, consistent...
So he's bringing in an interesting point. If this is a conglomeration of weak studies that are showing the same thing, I mean, that's kind of what he's implying. Is it worth taking seriously?
Outcomes, the overall evidence can become very strong. So class 1 evidence for cardiovascular disease mortality, pancreatic cancer, and diverticular disease. Now they found highly suggestive class 2 evidence for all-cause mortality, basically the risk of dying from any cause. So
again, healthy user bias, if fiber correlates with healthy people, are healthy people less likely to die overall? Like this just makes sense. This is common sense, right?
Longevity, essentially, coronary heart disease, and ovarian cancer. So again, not class 1, but class 2 basically means there is strong evidence that suggests that there is a benefit.
Doesn't mean anything. It's just about the p-value, dude. Like, have you read the paper or are you just making stuff up?
beneficial effect. Now, there was suggestive evidence, class 3 evidence, for 16 different outcomes. Again, a broad spectrum. And for class 4, which is weak evidence for benefit, there were 6 other outcomes that showed benefit. Now, again, we've covered studies on here where we're looking at fiber intake, risk of mortality, cardiovascular disease, cancer. Very consistently, you see a reduction in risk with increasing amounts of fiber, and it is a dose.
Not risk. Risk, again, is a cause and effect statement, right? You cannot inform on risk through epidemiological or even umbrella reviews of epidemiological nonsense, right? They just cannot do that. You need something else. You need the kind of you need some kind of randomized control study. By the way, there have been randomized control studies done on fiber, and I was done on it's an actual randomized control trial, right? It has I suppose it's not randomized. It's a control trial because they're looking at there's no control group, there's no placebo group, but they looked at people who had very bad constipation, and they put them on a zero fiber diet, and the constipation went away in 100% of cases. Right? Let me see if I can find the chart here. Yeah. Okay, here's the relevant sentence. For no fiber, reduced fiber, and high fiber groups respectively, meaning in order, symptoms of bloating were presented 0%. So on a no fiber group, everyone's constipation was cured. 31% in reduced fiber, and 100% of the people on a high fiber diet had markers of constipation. And again, straining to pass stools, 0% on a low fiber diet, almost half on a sort of low fiber, 0% on a no fiber diet, 43%, 44% on a low fiber diet, and 100% on a high fiber diet, right? So, at the end of, or at some point, Layne is going to ask, I think, for evidence that of low fiber correlating with better outcomes in a population. This is much higher quality evidence than whatever it is that Layne's citing here.
Dose response. In fact, one study.
So the study I just showed is a dose response. The more fiber, the worse the outcome, right? In that particular population.
That for every 10-gram increase in fiber, there was a corresponding 10% decrease in the risk of mortality.
And can you attribute that to the fiber? No, you can't, because these are correlational studies. First of all, they're also based on food frequency questionnaires and 24-hour recalls, right? So most people, if you ask them to name what they ate in 24 hours, they're not going to do a particularly good job. And with the food frequency questionnaires, you're asking them to name what they've eaten every week for the past year. Most people do an abysmally bad job. So even the quality of the data here is just so poor. And in fact, I've written extensively about this. There's an article on my blog which talks about how ice cream in all of these studies is a superfood, is a health food, correlates with much better outcomes than, say, low-fat yogurt or other foods that people think are healthy, right? So that's not to say don't go out and buy your ice cream. This isn't a license to say ice cream is a superfood. It's to say the opposite. It's saying that this data is so junky that even things that we're pretty sure, I can't say for sure, but definitely are not superfoods, right? Full of sugar, a mixture of sugar and fat should be avoided. I think everyone agrees with that. So, but still correlate with better outcomes. So this correlational data set can be very, very misleading.
That's powerful. In fact, so many of you guys...
It's not powerful just because you say it's powerful. It would be powerful. It could actually inform on anything, but it can't.
Guys worry about grounding mats and cold plunges and fat.
The grounding mats are ways to sort of ensure that the biological system, the electromagnetic biological system, which is the human being, has what it needs, which is to be grounded to the earth, right? Like any electrical system. Cold plunges, again, there's a lot of science understanding what the activation of heat shock proteins and so on does to the system. Fiber, this is all just associational junk data. And he's shown me RCTs, they're going to be mixed results at best. In fact, the RCT that I showed is actually far more interesting because, again, if you want to examine a hypothesis, really examine a hypothesis, you need to create experiments which will try to disprove it. And that experiment, at least in that particular case, seems to have disproven the hypothesis that fiber is good for the gut, right?
Fasting windows and biohacking. You're missing the main biohack that you can
So fasting is definitely a very good and better way. In fact, there's an interview on my channel with Gabor Ordosi where he talks about the fact that when you actually fast, you improve the gut microbiome. He hasn't talked about the microbiome in this, but that's the assumption because humans don't eat fiber. So what eats the fiber is the gut, right? Are the little microbes in the gut. And Gabor talks about how, well, when you actually fast, you have a bigger proliferation in so-called healthy I don't agree with these terms necessarily, healthy versus unhealthy gut bacteria, but the ones that most people think are healthy, they come back faster and in a better way after an extended fast than they do after whatever eating whatever fiber you want, right?
For longevity, which is dietary fiber intake.
It is absolutely not. So this is where it pissed me off because, if he had said what he's saying with a little bit more caution, with a little bit more grace, with a little bit more humility, I'd be fine. But the fact is, in my work, I see people every day who have damaged themselves by eating too much fiber because they were told by idiots like Layne Norton that fiber is healthy for all people at all times. And if he said something like, if you're struggling with digestion, if you're struggling with whatever, if you're struggling with health overall, maybe try increasing your intake of dietary fiber slowly. I wouldn't have such a big issue. I still disagree with that statement, but I, let it go. But when he makes these universal statements that the biggest thing you can do, bigger than fasting, bigger than cold plunges, bigger than grounding, is to increase dietary fiber, I mean, that's just nonsense. That's demonstrably nonsense, at least for some people. If it works for some people, maybe, but I can name people who have tried that advice and who've harmed themselves by that advice, and that's where I get really pissed off because, in my opinion, our first responsibility as clinicians, as practitioners, is to do no harm. And when I see people saying eat your fiber, I fear that they are doing. I mean, I see them doing harm. I see the victims. I see the people to whom they've done harm because they come to me afterwards and they say that didn't work for me. Maybe your way will work for me.
It has been shown young and old, men, women, people with type 2 diabetes, without type 2 diabetes.
No, it hasn't been shown in any of these populations, at least not by the data set that you're showing. What's been shown is weak associations that can be amplified by having big numbers and therefore sort of p hacking, right? It hasn't been shown in that way at all. And it would be a very difficult thing to show that because again, like we need to take the counterfactual. We need to look at the people who are not consuming fiber, like close to zero fiber, right? And not consuming junk. And that's a population that you haven't studied at all.
Metabolically healthy, metabolically unhealthy, kidney disease, no kidney disease, heart disease, no heart disease, cancer, no cancer. If you eat more fiber, you have less risk of dying.
That is chronically untrue. Absolutely untrue because, again, like I could be hit by a bus tomorrow, even though I just had 15 bowls of oatmeal. Like these are irresponsible statements. These are not, you cannot make cause and effect statements like that, right? And what I will say is there's no known mechanism whereby eating fiber will decrease your risk of cardiovascular disease, for example, right?
That is the take home. And this also jives with the new study that came out looking at the risk of stroke and fiber intake and found, again, for people who eat more fiber, they have a lower risk of stroke.
And can I see that study? Like, where is that study, Layne?
Regardless of the statistical model they used, people who ate less than...
I love how he caveats. So he's read the paper. He's not putting it up on the screen. I think maybe he's decided that he doesn't like the paper. He doesn't like the methodology, but he's referring to it anyway, right? He's putting the caveat at the front. If you don't like the statistical model they used, I don't like it either. But here's the result. Doesn't make any sense.
10 grams of fiber versus people who ate like 10 to 18 grams of fiber a day, there was about a 20-ish to 25% decreased risk of having a stroke. If you bump that above 18 grams of fiber a day, the risk went down to about 35%. Then
these are not risks. These are observational associations, right, between data sets. And again, one needs to ask, what was the diet in the data set that wasn't eating fiber? Was it a good, 80-90% carnivorous diet that people like me tend to recommend based on, a million years of human evolution or more? Or was it just junk food? And I don't think it's a secret which of those answers it's going to be.
If you look at the risk of mortality amongst people who have already had a stroke and dietary fiber intake, you get anywhere from like 20 to 30% decreased risk of mortality by consuming over 10 grams of fiber up to 18 versus less than 10. And if you go above 18, you get more like a 30 to 40% decreased risk of mortality for people who've had stroke. And you've got these carnivore idiots out here.
I would be one of the carnivore idiots. Thank you very much.
Saying things like, you don't need dietary fiber.
Why would you need indigestible carbohydrates? Like, under what circumstances would an animal need to be consuming foods that it cannot digest? Explain that to me first.
I cut out dietary fiber and I'm just fine.
No, I think that he's got a point. I think the n=1 stuff should be taken with a grain of salt. But I have never, and I've been doing this for a little while now, I have never seen someone who, when we reduced the intake of fiber, didn't do better. In fact, much better, right? So Yeah, the only person I can think of a client who just didn't want to reduce the amount of fiber, and after he worked with me, he worked with someone who wanted to increase fiber. Fine, whatever, that's your choice. But people who are willing to go on a low or no fiber diet, almost always we see benefit. Even people with chronic gut issues, irritable bowel syndrome, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, autoimmune bowel disease, like we can reverse all this stuff on a low enough fiber diet. And with it's not just the low fiber, there are other things as well, but fiber is not part of the solution, right? At least it doesn't have to be.
Fine need. Is not consuming any dietary fiber going to kill you tomorrow? No. Is it going to kill you a year from now? Probably not. Is it going to kill you 5 years from now? Unlikely. But if we're talking about the risk of mortality, lifetime exposure, eating.
How could you inform on that, right? Again, like, do we have people who have been eating purely carnivorous, no fiber, low fiber diets for 80, 90 years? We have, I mean, I can think of a couple of anecdotes and they're doing fine. But there's not a studied population. So to make conclusions about a population you haven't studied, that's the height of scientific irresponsibility, right?
More fiber versus less fiber probably isn't the difference between living to 40 versus living to 80, but it might be the difference between living to 72 versus 80. So if you
tell me how consuming indigestible carbohydrate will help any animal system. Like, how does it make any sense? I want you to eat these things you can't digest and you're going to do better. Like, it just doesn't make any sense, right?
want to live longer and have a higher quality of life and be healthier, you should consume fiber.
So the should stuff is interesting, right? Because now we're entering the state of like morality. What are you, like a priest now? Like, you should do whatever the hell you want to do. No one's going to stop you from doing what you want to do. If you want to consume, in my opinion, if you want to be healthy, then you want to start with the default diet for humans, which is a hypercarnivorous diet that is very low in fiber, right? For me, I don't particularly advise zero fiber, at least for most people in most circumstances, but very low. That's what seems to work for most people.
Not even talking about the gut microbiome benefits. Fiber.
So again, like when we look at the actual studies that have been done on the microbiome, we find that things like fasting, so not taking any fiber at all or anything else, seems to be a very good intervention for improving, quote unquote, improving, because I don't know how much we know about these things, but improving the composition of the gut microbiota. One of the best things to do seems to be fasting. And if fiber was an important component of that, that doesn't make any sense, right? Because when you're not eating anything, what the fiber evangelical crowd sort of tells you is when you don't eat fiber, then your little bugs, when you don't feed the bugs with fiber, those little bugs eat you. And I'm telling you, in study after study, fasting improves the microbiome. So that's just not true, right?
Is the single biggest lever you can pull for gut microbiome health.
So it's definitely not. So fasting is comparable or superior in RCTs, no question about that, right? So what he just said is demonstrably false.
And again, carnivore loonies will say, well, I ate fiber and I got inflamed. None of these people measured their CRP, which is the marker of inflammation that's typically.
So we can measure CRP. Yeah. I mean, I measure CRP pretty regularly and I don't eat any fiber and my CRP is rock bottom, right?
Used in studies. What is happening is they eat something with fiber in it and they get a tummy ache and they equate that with inflammation. Those are not the same thing. Some people have sensitivities to various fiber types. And for those folks, you should avoid sources of fiber that you know cause you gastrointestinal discomfort. But almost
all of them, like, listen, for people like me who've been vegan for any stretch of time, like fiber is toxic at this point to us. Like we can't digest much of any of it. And not just me, like I'm thinking about many people I know, like not even vegans, people who are vegetarian, my Indian vegetarian family, like lots of people who have just had too many vegetables and haven't had them processed properly. We need to rebuild the gut. And fiber are like it's little shards of glass in the gut, right? We don't want to be consuming them, especially insoluble fiber. I think soluble fiber maybe is a more nuanced discussion. But again, I take out soluble fiber in someone's diet. We always see improvements.
Everybody can find a source of fiber that will not cause them gastrointestinal discomfort.
But why would you want to? What is the advantage to eating carbohydrates that cannot be digested? Why would you want to do that?
It doesn't mean you should not eat fiber. Sure, you can still poop because fecal matter, a lot of it is just turned over intestinal cells. So yeah, you'll still poop without fiber. It'll be more difficult.
It will not be more difficult. So one of the first symptoms that most people have, if they transition too quickly to a purely carnivorous or even a mostly carnivorous diet, one of the problems we will see is that they have diarrhea. Diarrhea is the opposite of constipation. So I wish, one of the other problems with these guys is they're in their own silos. They don't talk to people outside their silos. They don't engage with people outside their silos, except to mock them on YouTube, right? But if you actually talk with someone who's been through a transition on a carnivore diet, they will tell you 9 times out of 10, and yes, 1 time out of 10, it is difficulty, passing stools. But 9 times out of 10, it is the opposite problem. You're having diarrhea all the time. You could even, Joe Rogan podcast or whatever, and where he talks about his experience of, what does he call it? Not trusting his farts. Like, there's many different entry points, but you should at least do a little bit of research before you make videos basically saying the opposite of what actually happens.
Frequent, but you can do it, but you're also stupid to do it. So again, pick a population. Somebody out.
Yeah, can I just say, Layne Norton calling someone else stupid is a bit of a joke, right? Because, just look at this video.
There, pick a population and show me where dietary fiber does not benefit them in terms of mortality.
I've just shown you a population. You want to look at it again? Here you go. Stopping or reducing dietary fiber intake reduces constipation and its associated symptoms. These were people who had bleeding. These are people who had were straining to pass stools. These are people with bad bloating. And when you reduce fiber intake, it increased. And when you reduce it all the way to 0, the symptoms of constipation go away completely. There's other examples too, right? So we talk about low FODMAP, a low FODMAP diet for people with certain kinds of autoimmune disease or autoimmune bowel disease or Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, and so on. So the whole low FODMAP, like that whole entry point into, which is a very mainstream term, that's about restricting certain fibers, right? And what you find is people on a low FODMAP diet tend to have a low fiber diet overall, and they get relief of their symptoms. So yeah.
Cardiovascular disease, cancer. Good luck.
So again, like, I've just given you examples. I've given you an example with an RCT, which is way superior to whatever you've shown here. But it is also the case, and I take this point from Layne, that these are populations that have not been studied. When you study a population on a low fiber diet, in the US in particular, what you are studying is a population that knows that they should be doing things for them, I put knows in quotes, has been told for years that they should be having more fiber and chooses not to. Now, what we can say about that population is that they're more likely to smoke, more likely to drink, less likely to exercise, less likely to take vitamins, less likely to engage in behaviors that correlate, or that in some cases may cause, increased longevity, increased lifespan, increased health span, etc. So we would expect, given the kind of dietary advice that has been handed out since the 1950s, in the West in particular, we would expect that people who weren't eating enough fiber would also die earlier. That's just my null hypothesis, right? So if you want to make an interesting study, you have to actually test that hypothesis. You have to find out, okay, is it the fiber that's responsible for that, or is it the healthy user bias? What are the kind of markers we could devise an RCT around? An RCT around, people with very serious constipation would be one example. There are RCTs coming into place around the carnivore diet and psychiatric issues. I know, depression and so on. I think I've read about some of these studies coming up. Maybe other autoimmune conditions as well. So again, like, just telling me your bias, which is basically what this video is, and telling me that the epidemiology confirms your bias, that's not science. That in some ways is the opposite of science. That's basically religion, right? I do a rain dance, it rains. I'm like, the rain dance caused the rain, dude. Maybe, but have you really tried to go out and do rain dances in places where it didn't rain, right? Did you do 100 rain dances, and how many of them include, led to rain? So yeah, I'd hate to, in some of this, like, these are not studies I would sign up to. I personally wouldn't sign up to a study that increased my intake of fiber. Like, not something I could do. But I'm sure you could find people who would be willing to do that. And I think what you'd find is that the results either don't change, or they change so little as to not be relevant, or in some cases they improve with removing fiber. Maybe, right? Because this is not a population that's been studied, or not interventions that have been studied.
If you want to live longer, have a higher quality of life, lower your risk of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, then you should be eating enough fiber. I recommend shooting for, at minimum, 20 grams.
Yeah, this is ridiculous. Now he's giving his own recommendations, as if anyone wants to listen to those. Okay, listen. What to say about this? Again, I don't think there's anything I can say that I haven't already said. If you're a serious scientist, you put forward a hypothesis and then you try to disprove it, okay? Now, someone could say, Samir, your hypothesis is that fiber is not beneficial. Have you tried to disprove that? And I would say, well, not, I mean, my hypothesis is based on first principles. My hypothesis is based on the fact that when you go to the market, you know, all those things in the market, especially in the vegetable section, were not available to humans for 99.9% of human existence. They've only become available in the past couple hundred years, right? My hypothesis is based on the anthropological data, which shows that humans were hyper carnivore based on the nitrogen 15 isotope analysis, right? So hypercarnivores, and then things like elephant bones next to human populations and so on. So hypercarnivores consuming big fatty animals. That's what we have been up until 12,000 years ago. And by the way, when we introduce those plant foods 12,000 years ago, when we introduce fiber, what happens? That's when we get chronic disease. That's when we get diabetes. That's when we get heart attacks. That's when we get strokes. Well, heart attacks a little bit later with the cultivation of wheat and the wheat eating population in Egypt and so on. But really, everything that we're referring to as chronic disease only happens post 12,000 years ago, based on what we can make out from the anthropological data. We also see a decrease in human stature. So our size gets smaller. We go from whatever it is, 6 feet on average plus to 5.5 feet on average plus, or whatever it is right now, right? Our statures get smaller, our head size gets smaller, indicating our brain size gets smaller. So based on the default diet that humans have evolved to eat, there was no fiber there, right? So again, like if that's my null hypothesis based on 2 million years or a million years of human evolution, and if someone wants to disprove that, I think the burden of proof is on them. And a lot of where I end up disagreeing with the Layne Nortons of the world, or whoever it is, the vegans of the world, is like, on whom does the burden of proof lie? Does it lie on me, who wants humans to eat as they've been eating for a million years, or for 300,000 years, whenever you want to start the story? Or does it rely on you, who thinks that the foods that humans have introduced very recently, introduced mostly, by the way, to feed enslaved populations? So are the foods that rich humans have introduced to feed enslaved humans, are those the best possible food for humans? It just seems an unlikely hypothesis. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.